The nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The brain is part of the central nervous system. The brain is very well protected. There are the bones of the skull that completely surround the brain, and then there is cerebrospinal fluid that flows around the brain to act as a waterbed. Additionally, there are three membranes known as the meninges. The outermost of these is the dura mater. This is a very tough membrane. Part of it is fused to the periosteum of the skull bones, and parts of it descend into the brain, dividing the brain into sections. The middle layer is the arachnoid mater, the spider mother. It gets its name because there are these spider web extensions that extend from it down to the pia mater, the innermost lining of the meninges. It is in the subarachnoid space that the cerebrospinal fluid is found. And then the pia mater is the delicate mother. This is the one that is directly adhered to the brain. The dural folds, those extensions of the dura into the brain, help divide the brain into right and left pieces. We have the falx cerebri. This goes down between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. There is the tentorium cerebelli. This helps divide the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then there is the falx cerebelli. This helps divide the cerebellum into two hemispheres. There are four major components of the brain: the cerebrum, which is the largest, most superior part; the cerebellum, which is this smaller part sort of in the back underneath, looks a little bit like cauliflower; the diencephalon, which is centrally located in the brain; and then the brainstem. The brainstem is continuous with the spinal cord. As we look at this human brain, here is the cerebrum, very large, prominent. Here is the cerebellum, and the brainstem is seen just right here as it goes into the spinal cord. Looking at this cross section, we see the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem, and this is the only way we can see the diencephalon, the central part of the brain. The brain has cavities or spaces in it. These are known as the ventricles. There are two lateral ventricles. These are inside the cerebrum. These are continuous with the third ventricle, which is found in the diencephalon. This also is continuous with the fourth ventricle, which is between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the ventricles and will flow through them. At the fourth ventricle, there are ways for the cerebrospinal fluid to get into the subarachnoid space to circulate around the brain, and some of it continues down the central canal of the spinal cord. Here we can see the opening to the lateral ventricle. Here is the space where the third ventricle would be, and then here is the location of the fourth ventricle. The brain is divided into right and left halves, or right and left hemispheres. So here we see the right side, and this is the left side. The cerebrum shows folds and shallow grooves. The folds are the gyri, a singular is gyrus. The shallow grooves are the sulci, singular would be sulcus. Now some of the grooves are deeper, and these are known as fissures. So we have the longitudinal fissure. This will divide the cerebrum into right and left hemispheres. And then we have the transverse fissure. This is the rather deep groove between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The lobes are named for the bones under which they lie, and there are some sulci that are a little deeper that help define these. The frontal lobe would be under the frontal bones, the temporal lobe would be underneath the temporal bones, the parietal lobe would be underneath the parietal bones, and the occipital lobe would be underneath the occipital bones. The cerebrum has its doorway to the lateral ventricle, since the lateral ventricles are located in the cerebrum. And then we have the corpus callosum and the fornix. The corpus callosum is sort of the roof of the lateral ventricles, and the fornix is sort of the floor. These are composed of white matter. These are tracts or axons that help connect the right and left sides of the brain. The corpus callosum handles conscious information. The fornix handles unconscious information. The diencephalon houses the third ventricle. The thalamus make up the walls of the third ventricle. You have to think of the diencephalon as sort of a box. The epithalamus makes up the roof of the third ventricle, and it's associated with the pineal body. And then the hypothalamus makes up the floor of the third ventricle. The hypothalamus is associated with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by this stalk of tissue known as the infundibulum. The brainstem has three major components. We have the midbrain, and it's easy to find the midbrain because we look for the corpora quadrigemina, or the two twins. The pons is the rounded area that makes the brainstem look a little bit pregnant, and then we have the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata simply tapers into the spinal cord. Here you see the fourth ventricle nestled between the cerebellum and the brainstem. On the underside, you can see a couple of the cranial nerves. Here is the olfactory bulbs. This would be cranial nerve 1, and this is the optic chiasma. The optic chiasma is where the optic nerves cross because they take information to opposite sides of the brain. The cerebrum is the large part. Here is the cerebellum. Here is the diencephalon. Here is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The corpus callosum is that connection between the conscious brain, and the fornix is the connection between the unconscious brain, the right and left halves. This opening would be to the lateral ventricle. The pineal gland is associated with the epithalamus of the diencephalon. The thalamus are the walls of the diencephalon, and the hypothalamus make up the floor of the diencephalon. The infundibulum would have the pituitary attached to it here. The corpora quadrigemina are a good landmark for finding the midbrain, which is part of the brainstem. On the underside, you can see the olfactory bulbs. Here is the optic nerve, and it's going to cross at the optic chiasma. The cerebellum is here at the base of the brain. Here is the pons. Here is the medulla, and the medulla just tapers into the spinal cord.